Hi, everyone. I'm Rajshri Patil, founder of India Design Forum, and I'm joined by the co-curator of this program, Mrinalini Gadiuk, an architect, writer, and researcher. Together, we are very happy to welcome you all to the third session of the IDF Architecture Debates, Building Blocks. The idea really germinated from many conversations that we had over the months where we found ourselves repeatedly asking the question, what builds the blocks of architecture? So we thought, hey, let's fearlessly question the mechanisms that make architecture relevant today. This is a platform wherein we bring together leading minds from the architecture community to share their perspectives, their curiosities, and inquiries about actually what builds this community. Through these discussions, we hope to provoke thought and create discourse around critical ideas that often get forgotten in the midst of our daily lives. Mrinalini?
So, like we've mentioned, and we've discussed this with our speakers, but I think it's also important to tell our audience that this is not a showcase of portfolios and works necessarily. But the idea behind these talks was to have a candid and informal discussion and to bring professionals together to talk about some of the subjects that we've chosen. And those have been kept intentionally broad-based so that we can start exploring these ideas and take it into places that are usually not either discussed or spoken about for various reasons. We've had a very interesting lineup of people, and we're very excited to introduce our speakers today. We've got Abha Narayan Lamba, who's based in Bombay. We have Ayaz Basrai, who's in Goa currently, and we've got Asim Waqif, who's in Delhi. So we've got people from across the country, and we're very, very excited to have you with us.
So I'm delighted to introduce Abha Narayan Lamba of ANL Associates. It's really difficult. It's a challenge to actually introduce her in a few seconds. However, I'm going to make an honest try. She's a practicing conservation architect based in Mumbai, a recipient of the Eisenhower Fellowship, Charles Wallace Fellowship, the Attingham Trust Fellowship, the Sanskriti Award, and many other accolades. And her firm is today India's largest architectural conservation consultancy, working with IRCOM, the Global Heritage Fund, the World Monuments Fund, and serving on the heritage committees of both Delhi and Mumbai. Over 2 decades, they've focused on conservation and museum projects across the country, including the restoration of the 15th century temples in Ladakh and Hampi, mosques, palaces, forts, caravanserais in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Punjab, ancient Buddhist sites of Ajanta and Bodh Gaya, and regional conservation in Kanchipuram and Shekhawati, and colonial heritage across Delhi, Pune, Nainital, Kerala, and Mumbai. And if you live in Bombay, you'll be delighted that she's changed the face of Bombay. She's restored several buildings, the Crawford Market,
Stop right there.
the heritage buildings of the banks in Bombay, the Victorian landmarks, and I could go on and on. The firm has won several UNESCO World Heritage awards, and Abha has done a lot of pioneering work. Very, very proud of what Abha's contribution to conservation restoration has been over the past 2 decades. Welcome, Abha.
So, and joining us also is Ayaz Basrai, who graduated in industrial design, specializing in product design from the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. This was in 2003. 3 years later, he set up the Basrai Design Studio. There's an interesting story behind the name, I believe. But and he set it up with his brother Zamir as an independent design studio specializing in the design and creation of built environments. With wide-ranging interests in illustration, immersive media, design, and research, Ayaz is constantly dabbling in the ever-expanding latitude of design expression. More recently, he established the studio's research arm, the Basrai Lab, based in Goa, which works on research and design projects in the domain of heritage and conservation and future research at the intersection of architecture, technology, design, and art. And we're particularly keen to tap into a little bit of his future research part of things today. So we're hoping to see a lot more of that. A very warm welcome, Ayaz.
Thank you.
Asim Waqif studied architecture at the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, and is currently teaching as visiting faculty there. After initially working as an art director for film and television, he started making independent video and documentaries before moving to a dedicated art practice in 2010. His recent projects have attempted a crossover between architecture, art, and design with a strong contextual reference to contemporary urban design and the politics of occupying, intervening, using public spaces. Some of his projects have developed within abandoned and derelict buildings in the city that act like hidden activity spaces for marginalized people. Concerns of ecology and anthropology often weave through his work, and he has done extensive research on vernacular systems of ecological management, especially with respect to water, waste, and architecture. Delighted to have you with us this evening, Asim.
So without further ado, I think what I would like to just, one of the reasons why the three of you are here with us today is I'd like to introduce you all to our audience today as the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, if I can. But the idea being is that, of course, Abha, you're working with heritage, you're working with conservation, and we're kind of, tagging you to the idea of history and the past. Asim, you are doing a lot of work in the sustainable space and working with the current, the present. And that's where your interest lies, the whole idea of deconstructing and then constructing again. And Ayaz, you've been doing a lot of work in terms of anticipating the future. So it would be really interesting if each one of you, maybe Abha, we could start with you, if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction in terms of the space that you come from and to build a context of what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Oh, well, I graduated from the School of Planning and Architecture in 93. And the reason I joined architecture was to work with Joseph Allen Stein, and he was my absolute hero. So I went for my interview to meet the master, and I showed him my portfolio. And it's, when you're just starting out in your career, you really don't have an idea of where you're heading. And it's only from another person's perspective, they can probably see what you're good at. And this great architect, who is very, very modest, turns around and told me, "You seem to have an interest in urban conservation issues, and here we only do architecture." I was happy as an intern to be folding blueprints for the rest of my life in his office and just cleaning up the pantry. But I think that got me started. And what I've realized over the last 27 years is that when we see buildings in India today, and that's a sad reality, most of our cities have an intense historic fabric. Whether it's Mumbai, Delhi, Calcutta, every city has a warp and a weft of old and new. And each city, earlier we would go to a city like Lucknow, and 40 years ago, you would go to Lucknow, you would eat the local cuisine, you would go to the local, see the local architecture, and each building was rooted in context. Oh, I'm not saying now. I think now we still see a new direction in contemporary Indian architecture. But through the 70s and 80s and 90s, we have created buildings without context. So if you go now to Lucknow, you walk into a glass facade or an aluminum clad building, and you go into a mall and you buy the same Alan Solly or Marks and Spencer product, and you come back. And where has that whole concept of going into chalk, looking through old gullies and finding chicken curry, eating the local kebab? The whole idea of architecture responding to the context is something that we have almost lost in the last few decades. And we've lost our context at such an alarming rate that not only the old buildings are being demolished, but the new architecture has no soul because it's a copy paste job. It could be in Dubai, it could be in New York, or it could be in Lucknow. And this is just an example. The same devastation has happened in all our cities. And before it's too late, I realized that what I loved most about Stein was the fact that in a very strong historic context of the Lodi Gardens, he had built contemporary buildings like the Ford Foundation, which is really my favorite, and India Habitat Center, which I worked on as a young architect. And these buildings were contemporary buildings. They were not copies. They were completely buildings of their time. and yet they respected the texture, the tonality, the materials of the context. That is something as a profession, I think woefully we have lost in the last 2-3 decades. And for me, therefore, I felt both. I think both understanding a deep need to save whatever was being rapidly lost, and B, ensuring that I could do my little bit of reducing that urban clutter, that what we are adding to our urban landscapes, either reducing it or at least looking at building in context. So yes, that's been a part of my journey.
So it's interesting that you talk about it like this, because, you know, when we are looking at, you talk about the urban context and you talk about contemporary building, but what is, you know, current today will be the past tomorrow, will become heritage tomorrow.
Exactly.
And it's literally a moment of time, right, where this transformation takes place and what is the future becomes the present. I want to bring in Asim over here and ask you, Asim, you are a qualified architect, but you chose not to, you know, to kind of express yourself through the built, or I'd be wrong by saying built environment, but through habitable buildings. But your expression was more in terms of art, but yet looking at certain qualities or certain values which are more tagged to architecture and talking about present day. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, actually, I didn't practice architecture because I found architectural offices really boring. Sitting in front of a computer and working on CAD environments. Even as I finished my course, I realized that I had been taught how to make these complex construction drawings of things, but I had very little experience with materials themselves.
Mm.
So I've done many different kind of apprenticeships over the years and trying to pick up new skills and new ways of working, and that helps when you're working with skilled people also, because not only do you have a theoretical or a drawing level understanding of things, but also in terms of tools or processes that have to be employed. So and I just accidentally chanced on the art scene, frankly. um, but it has given me good opportunities. And the interesting thing in art is that um, one doesn't have to look at any subject from only one perspective. When you're in a client relationship or when you're an activist, a lot of times things get polarized. But for me, at least, the art space allows me to look at things from many different sides, and and I'm just trying to have some fun, actually.
So why does sustainability become an important value for you to explore?
I mean, look at the crisis we are in right now. It's over exploitation, and also if you look at the way the market is designed, it's meant to actually, I mean, we call it consumption. Consumption actually was another name for tuberculosis, for many years. It's means to finish things, really, and that's what we call our economic system. Um, so sustainability is important, but I find that sustainability today is sort of being discussed as a new subject. Ideas like closed loop systems or local renewable resources or low energy footprint, they're being propagated as new ideas. But I have found in my own research that actually most pre-industrial societies anywhere in the world, these ideas are really important. However, today, I think there's so much polarization. Uh, your left wing or right wing or your old school or new, that I think there is very little space left for people with disparate ideas to actually sit and have a constructive discussion. More often than not, right now, we talk to people we agree with and we avoid people uh, that we disagree with. And it's the same. And also, social media and electronic platforms are perpetuating this sort of clannish behavior. So I think it's really important to engage with things that we don't understand, that even if we understand, we don't agree with. So in sustainability specifically, I think it is really, really important for us to look at traditional knowledge, as well as new technologies as something that can work in tandem and support each other, take care of each other's faults. There are faults in both things. Like traditional systems, although they develop over many generations and they are very sort of sensitive to the local climate and topography, and uh, but they can get bogged down by ritual, by repetition.
Mm.
While new technologies give us a
Mm.
lot of resources, but also leave behind quite often a lot of byproduct. Uh, so I think it's more interesting to actually combine what is futuristic with what is the past, to be able to see what we can do in the present, rather than be only on one side or the other.
Most definitely. In fact, I want to pick up on the idea of what you said, where we're only talking to people that we agree with. And I think we're not having enough provocative conversations. We're not being able to provoke each other enough in order to actually, promote our own thought and think of different things and think in different lines. And Ayaz, I want you to come in over here to tell us a little bit about the stuff that you're doing, because that seems to be rather provocative, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's just amazing to listen to both Abha and Asim. And what's I think lovely is that there's a crying need to build bridges, right? In many ways. So and I don't think these bridges are they don't exist. I think these bridges have just fallen so far out of our imagination of either the discourse around the future or the discourse around the past. I think that we kind of almost overlook them. I could give you one example, right? So, like, if you look at the Konark temple, the etymology of the word Konark actually means corner and sun, right? Ark is sun and Kona is corner. Now, it's almost like an invitation, from the builders of the Konark temple. I think it's 1230 AD, like, maybe 800 years ago. They were kind of inviting people to build with solar panels, right? I mean, it's almost like a invitation, like that. That this is lovely solar technology available, which will probably get available and get efficient in somewhere in the mid 2000s, and use this technology and build new age sun temples. But what our contemporary technology does is it sort of creates land grabs, right? I mean, you have massive land grabs to kind of plant fields and fields of solar panels, which have to be manually cleaned every day with a pipe by illegal water from some subcontracted well in another village, 20, 30 kilometers away. So how green this technology is anyone's guess. I mean, the efficiency of solar panels drops by 25% after a single dust storm, right? So there are these bridges that need to be built between the sort of constant pursuit of beauty, right? I really personally believe that beauty is the generator. Like that, if the sort of end product is something that has to be beautiful, you will manifest that beauty with whatever technology, whatever tools that you're given. I mean, I find it tough to imagine that people who built, the step wells in Jaipur are actually, building this out of like some sort of efficiency or kind of, a response to a market or a brief. I mean, these are very deeply ingrained, cultural systems. And I mean, you give the same materials and the same kind of processes to, like someone like who's running a contemporary practice. I mean, they'll shit all over it. So I think it's a matter of like, I think just, accepting that there are these bridges that need to be built, and what are the values around which you build those bridges. Right. So then it becomes almost agnostic to technology or material or context. I mean, it becomes something which is much larger, and it's I guess, a way of furthering the human ambition, or the, whatever it is that makes us human in the first place.
So are you trying to say that if, there are only certain ways to build or certain material to build with, if you're going to build responsibly? Because today's talk is titled, How Does One Build Responsibly, right? But the question also lies in who is responsible for the building. So are we saying that only there's only certain types of people who can build responsibly, or there are only certain sort of methodologies to follow? Because you could give the same material to certain people and they might not do justice to it, but that doesn't mean that they cannot build responsibly with other material.
I mean, you see, also this, I mean, again, I'd love for this to be open, but like, I think for me, like all these things exist on spectrums, right? The most responsible building is the one that is not built, right? Like, so,
Exactly.
I mean, so in that sense, like Abha's work takes on a whole new kind of meaning, because one is already conserving resources that have already been poured into something exquisitely beautiful, right? And now to reimagine those structures or to bring them back into public imagination, like, I mean, what the Opera House has done for Bombay's ego as a city, you know, it's like, it's incredible, right? You feel a sense of ownership, and you feel this kind of pride that is completely devoid from anything that BKC can offer us, right? So
Sure, yeah.
there's a certain grammar there, which is, I think, what you're really going there to observe is what we've lost, right? I mean, you're going there to feel this deep sense of loss. I mean, even, you know, we use nostalgia very commonly as a term or a tool in design, right? But I mean, we tend to forget that nostalgia was a diagnosable disease at one point. Like, you could be hospitalized from nostalgia.
I would have been in ICU.
Oh, God.
So the question that comes to my mind and to any one of you is, so basically, who are we building for and what are we building for? I mean, on one side, we're so proud of these heritage buildings, and obviously the people who built, you know, even the stepwells, built with a sense of engineering precision, and they built it for a purpose, and they built it with deep sense of aesthetic sensibilities, and with materials that were also, you know, valuable. On the other hand, we also, I think Asim mentioned, you know, safe environments, and we've always wanting, you know, to be in the safe category. So safe cells. So so is that what every architect is moving towards? So, I mean, lots of things have come up already with the conversation. So I'm just asking you all to respond to that.
Well, I could say that about my practice. You know, for normally what you expect in a practice is that you, or a project, there's a client and there's a brief, and then you're, as an architect, you deliver that brief. I think in my own career, the project that yes, I've normally hoped that I have a client who has money and who has a project and he has a brief. But I think if I look back at my career, I've had most of my projects where there was no money, there was no brief, and there was a crying need for something. So one of my first projects in '98 was the streetscaping for Dadabhai Naroji Road. Now it belonged to actually nobody, because nobody was looking after it. We had penguin shaped litter bins and yellow scalloped mild steel painted dividers. So it was, I think it was more kind of just the sheer anguish of seeing that in my city that drove me to work with, you know, local shopkeepers and get every shopkeeper to pay for the cast iron railing outside, or the cast iron litter bin, or the stone paving. So sometimes, I mean, it's good to say that yes, there is a patron and there's a client, and that would be the perfect sort of a kind of a Howard Rowe kind of a relationship, but that really doesn't exist. Most of the time, if you really want to make a difference, you cannot play safe. And I think the problem in our community is that for too many years we've played too safe for too long, and that's why when you look around us, look at what we see. So I think it's important to, for an architect. To me, architecture is the most political profession, because you know, every other kind of throughout history, when a governor, you know, the person who's ruling, the monarch or the pharaoh, wants to make a very strong statement, it is through architecture. So it's not that, you know, the Egyptian pyramids were not thought through, or in colonial architecture, what was the reason that they were initially referring to Hellenic examples and putting in, you know, copies of the Parthenon in, you know, in Chennai. It's because it's subconsciously they were putting this idea of the European greater civilization teaching the natives what it was, and that continues. The reason that Nehru broke away from the colonial British model and got a French architect to break free from history at that point and got Le Corbusier to design Chandigarh and concrete. It's a different thing that later I was working on a conservation management plan for UNESCO. So that too becomes heritage. Point being, architecture is a very strong political statement. And you call a great leader, the architect of the nation, but also we had these masters. You had the Corbusiers and these masters who were really leaving an imprint on posterity. I think architects in the last few decades have stopped taking themselves too seriously, and that's why we are not getting buildings that I hope we do now, but I think in the last 30, 40 years, we've not had enough quality buildings that would withstand the test of time, which we would want to even conserve. So it's ourselves as a profession who've been wanting to play safe and in a way diluting our own brand as a profession. It's the ones who've played unsafe and on the edge and taken risks who've always stood out in this profession.
So you're saying that we are not building our future heritage.
I'm hoping that we begin to take up our future legacy more seriously. I mean, if you look around, what do we have to say, you know, barring a few architects who've actually added to the landscape. If you see the city, I was in a college, architecture college, and there was one, young cocky student who said, "Why should I look at conservation?" I said, "Don't, but just to take a poll and name 5 of your favorite buildings in Mumbai." And when we took the poll, none of them were built in the last 30 years. So I hope that there are enough new architects who add to the landscape in such amazing way that 30 years down the line, we count their buildings among the top 5. So it's really about that.
There's also like a few interesting ideas to kind of unpack in that, right? Like I think, say for example, like, there's an imagination that architecture is for posterity, or architecture is built to kind of to withstand the ravages of time and to kind of to be contextual across the sort of the large span of time. And I think it's also interesting that the collapse of public architecture right now mirrors the collapse of public institutions. I mean, you have like the large scale dismantling of public institutions. I mean, do we really need a library anymore? Do we need, so I feel like, I mean, from a futures perspective, I mean, we're also entering the era of the post-Anthropocene, which is essentially, I mean, the Anthropocene being the era that is marked by human, like we've already left plastics in the fossil record and stuff like that. So, there are, we've kind of managed to do that. And, in that sense, I mean, it just calls into question many things that, say, for example, do future buildings need to be designed for non-human entities, right? Like, do we need to actually design more efficient server farms that allow us to, like what's the use of a municipal corporation if it's being run by, say, an artificial intelligence? Right, like what does that building need to be? Like, what are the specs of that building, right? So it needs to be well cooled. It probably needs to be underground. So there are these kind of interesting, provocations that one throws up. And if say in the world of adaptive reuse, if the whole mill district of Bombay gets converted into a server farm and people are actually living in Alibag and kind of, outside the city, I mean, the city is, it's really to witness ecocide in action, right? I mean, to live in Delhi in the last 2-3 months, or to live in Bombay during the monsoons. I mean, you're seeing the large scale dismantling of the idea of living in a city. So, is the city what we really need? And if so, what are we building for? Are we building for non-human entities in the future? The idea of the user becomes more an efficient semiconductor brick.
No, that's really interesting. And Asim, I would like for you to respond to that, because you also, through your work, also you talk a little bit about, the experience of space and the experience of your work, and how that differs if there's, let's say, within your installation, if there's one person as opposed to when there are hundreds of people. So your idea of occupation of space, if you could, add to that.
Well, actually, I kind of agree with Abha. I mean, the state of architecture is really very sad. Either, I mean, even the iconic buildings that have been built are rather lame, in my view. But when we look at conservation, also I find some problems. Like, there's this museum in Paris, Musée de Quai Branly, which has an amazing collection of musical instruments from around the world. They're all in this climate-controlled, isolated boxes. So the object itself has got conserved and preserved, but it is in such a state that nobody knows how to play it or how to make a new one. So I find that in conservation, more often than not, the emphasis becomes on conserving the object. While what I'm really interested in personally is the ideas and the concepts that led to that object, and whether those ideas can become a continuum through the present and go into the future. Uh, you know, so that is a very tough space because it's all sort of unquantifiable, intangible sort of information. And I think it's also very closely linked with how education is happening today. Uh, because from things being taught from generation to generation, now we've gotten into very theoretical modes of learning. So, in a school, in a biology textbook, you might learn about flower and stamen and whatever, but you rarely know about the flowering cycle of the trees that are growing in your own school or in your own backyard. So there is a sort of a dissociation between the immediate environment and the immediate social circle also in terms of the teaching aspect, you know. So yeah, so I mean, conservation is for me. I mean, I there's so many ways of conserving also. I mean, so but I'm still a little not convinced about the idea that we have to preserve objects. I'm more interested in what led to that object and whether that thought process has any relevance today.
Asim,
So okay, go ahead, Ayaz. No, sorry.
No, so I mean, there's a very interesting thing. Like, if you look at this idea of propagation, right? Like about how things propagate. I mean, you find some lovely examples in music, right? Like you look at, say, Chhap Tilak, like this, Qawwali written by Amir Khusro somewhere in 13th century, and it's probably performed like over like what 50, 60 places every day across different mehfils and across different formats. And I think somewhere in there is a really interesting metaphor for propagation, because I think what ensures the longevity of Chhap Tilak is its regular practice, and it's that idea of the riyaz, or that idea of the gharana, where you have people who are not even your blood relatives. I mean, they're not people who necessarily are the same family, but they're this sort of larger conception of family which is accumulated over time. And there are proteges, and there's a master and apprentice
It's sort of the apprenticeship model of sort of
apprenticeship model.
learning.
Exactly. I mean, and
Yeah.
you can see, and that's why the Qawwali is now still in Coke Studio, and it still has resonance because of the retelling of these stories. It's not like it's exactly. I mean, the saddest museum of musical instruments is the one that you can't play the musical instruments, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's incredible. It's like an incredible travesty. It's like having a museum of dance with pictures of dancers. So it's a kind of it's just an imagination disease. Like it's some kind of a thing. Like what does this museum actually need to do?
Yeah.
I mean,
So by that logic, it's like saying that do we want to conserve buildings as monuments, or on the other hand, what is becoming more and more popular today is the idea of adaptive reuse?
See, I think so some of these things are interesting to decode in terms of values, right? Like, so for example, we were doing some research into the Basilica in Old Goa, right? Which is I mean, it's part of the Holy Hill, and it's part of now every single monument on that Holy Hill is plastered, except for the Basilica, which has the mortal remains of Saint Francis Xavier, right? Now, if you look back at seeing why this building was unplastered, it was because that dominant order of Christianity wanted to show that basilica was older than the rest, right? So they basically stripped off the plaster of that building to make it look older than it actually is. So exposed laterite looks older than a plastered building. So there are certain embedded politics in the way a building looks, right? So because they wanted to establish the dominance of that order and the antiquity of that order. Because this is a time in Goa politically when all these other orders were collapsing. The Sikh cathedral gets, all these the smaller orders, and the Roman Catholic Church is actually taking precedence now. So I mean, then every act of intervention in that building has to be really, really thought out, right? Like, does your window on the pane of that building need to be a shell window? Does it need to be stained glass? Does it need to be and the choice that you make has to be a slice in time, that this is that time. Like, authenticity is actually something that varies across time. So the authentic form of something has a lot of embedded politics.
But having said that, I agree with Ayaz on that. And I think, again, in my practice, I've shied away largely from just dealing. Okay, yes, there's some monuments that need to be monuments, and that, like, you wouldn't want to adaptively reuse Ajanta caves for anything other than
Sure,
Ajanta
of
caves.
course.
But having said that, for too long, we've had this. I think ever since the establishment of the Archaeological Survey of India, which is 1860s. So it's a very Victorian approach. But unfortunately, in our country, we've had this really myopic Victorian approach that this is the building and this is my ring fence around it, and I treat it, and I
Yeah.
lock the fence at 6 p.m. and the chowkidar
Mm.
goes away and I can see it, but I can't enter, I can't do
Yeah.
anything, I can't touch. And I think unfortunately that's been, through our urban milieu, that's been the general idea. So, when I was doing my thesis in Jaunpur on the Sharqi mosques, there was this fantastic tomb. And because ASI had this 1 meter away, it had a metal barricade and fence, and they locked it up. The right next to it was a pawn shop, so you could actually spit on that building across a meter and a half and reach it. There was a public urinal, there was a bus adda. The problem is that we've always kept our monuments as individual museum pieces. Usko chuna mat, usko kuch karna mat. And in a way, then the loss that sense of ownership and that intimate connect between the citizen or the stakeholder and the monument. So I think I was very, very conscious about this. So whether it was working with local Ladakh villagers in restoring the Maitreya Buddha temple, or I think the entire conservation movement in Mumbai has been involved with living buildings. So, I always feel that why does Bombay have a different approach to conservation than, say, Delhi or Agra? Is because in Delhi or Agra, you imagine कि कोई भी historic building है, it will be under state central rule, and they would have that chokidar approach to it. Whereas in Mumbai, you have a very different engagement with historic buildings. So if you're from the city, you probably have been born in a Sarkari hospital, which is an old building. You go to school in a historic building, whether it's JB Pettit or Bombay Scottish or any of those. Your library, Asiatic Library, David Sassoon Library, JB Pett, your library, your hospital. If you go to court, you go to a marriage registrar. You take a train from Bandra station to VT. These are all heritage buildings, and because the average Mumbaiker uses these buildings and has this, there's a sense of ownership. So if I was working on Bandra station, I would be working on conserving it, and every person who would be taking the train would have an opinion, and they would come up to me and say, "Acha, ye acha dikh raha hai, ye acha nahi dikh raha hai, isko light thoda aur maro." So that is, I think, why, because in Mumbai you don't have that luxury of just standing and staring at something beautiful. We are actively using every space. There's a very strong link between the citizen and the historic building, and because they're constantly used. So if you take away, it's like that musical instrument which is locked up. You take away the use of a building, you take away its relevance in contemporary society. It's prone to die because it's going to have first pigeons and then bats, and then it's just going to go into dilapidation.
So in a sense, you're stressing about the relevance of a structure. You're stressing about the relevance of a structure for the present, for the future, and a respect for that has to be inculcated.
Sometimes in our country, we have too much respect. We treat our historic buildings sometimes like the 1970 movies of that widowed mother, old, wearing, with no money, wearing a white sari, and she'd be like a Leela Chitnis, just dukhi. And she would go blind, she would be ill, nobody would give her medicine. But isko kuch karna nahi, isko makeup nahi lagana, theek nahi karna, haircut nahi dena. So you would let your historic buildings die, but not do anything.
That's very funny.
So ages ago, we were in a master's studio, and we were working on Humayun's tomb. This is like 93. And I suggested that in one of the gates of Humayun's tomb, which was not the tomb, but the outer perimeter gate, and Arab Ki Sarai, I said Arab Ki Sarai was meant as a sarai. It was where the craftsman would stay. And a sarai, by definition, is where you live, you eat, you breathe, you do other things. Why can't that be turned into like a fantastic place for crafts and cafes, and so it'll become bustling? And my faculty thought that was the most disastrous horrific, statement I could make. So it's the problem because in England, I was working as my internship at the Lincoln Cathedral. There was a cafe inside the cathedral. You can actually rent or take on hire for an event, a wedding. You can, or a champagne party. You can go up to London Bridge and host a private party there, and that pays for its conservation. Here, we will neither, raise funds for the conservation nor allow a building to be used in a nice, sensitive manner and not give clean toilets. We will not still increase our ticket pricing. So it's a recipe for disaster because we are treating that our this like a sacred cow, which we let die of starvation, but not help out.
There's some stuff which is very resonant, and there are certain platforms, like, say, for example, one of the things that we tried to do in some of the monuments in Old Goa was to actually take a drone to kind of to essentially extract a three-dimensional model, like a topographical model of that monument, and it's documented using a process called photogrammetry. So essentially you would extract the sort of the three-dimensional model from this. It's a very high resolution model, also extracted at scale, with all the texture mapping and all the surface detail. And we were trying to move them into game environments, right? Like, so you essentially have a gamified version of a sort of a very significant heritage model. And what this is doing, say, for example, if you have a digital asset, which is, say, a disused, parish or a disused church in a particular precinct, what you could do is digitally repatriate objects into that model. Right, because physical repatriation is in many ways very, very complicated. Like, you have a very, very thriving antiques and sort of a gray market, which all these artifacts and all, they find their way into personal collections and into privatized homes. But you can digitally bring these back because there's a certain relevance and a certain position for ornament within the monument, which is lost when it goes into a showcase. Right, so you can actually create a much more accurate virtual model, which can be experienced with the choir singing in the background through binaural audio, and you can do all these really lovely things. But just by changing the platform, by saying that you can have a overlaid virtual model onto a real monument, and where can you fill the gaps between in the experiential quality of it, like what is the kind of acoustic quality of a full choir playing inside a basilica. Like, I don't think any one of us are going to be able to imagine that, like, when the organ is played, but a lot of these things can actually be done through collaborations, done through other ways, which I feel, if we achieve what Asim was talking about, having a sense of continuity between the ages, like, that you adapt the best of what technology is available to you. I mean, I think even within working with the deep past, I think one need not be, dismissive of the future, I guess. I mean, that's one of the ways in which one could maybe reconcile these two worlds.
No, completely, because we can't stop the train at any point, right? It is a constant. Like we said, it is a matter of moments when the past becomes the present, the present becomes the future. And there's nothing stopping that. It is what you're building currently, which is going to become our legacy and is going to become our heritage tomorrow. So, even if you look at something like metro stations across the world or metro systems across the world, whether it's in New York or whether it's in Uzbekistan. I was there last year, and it's absolutely stunning what they've done with their metro stations there, right? But it's not something that, yes, they were made so many years ago and they are beautiful and they're part of their heritage, but it's not something that you stand back and you look at, right? It's not wet paint that you tell people not to touch and therefore they're going to touch and they're going to spit at it, like what Abha is saying. But in fact, even in Delhi, in the last 15 years, the Delhi metro that has come up has given, it's efficient, it works well, it's clean. But I feel that if you give people something to be proud of, they'll take care of it.
Yes, they
right?
will.
And
Yeah.
so this has the potential to become the future of the city today.
And also maybe to load some of these systems and monuments with a couple of more values, right? Like if, for example, each Delhi metro station had to be adopted by a certain crafts cluster to kind of, not just decorate, but imagine, like what are the structural qualities of, like, say, I mean, what Asim does with, say, with the pandals in Kolkata, right? I mean, if one had to take that to a scale of a metro station, which has to be renewed every 2 years or every 3 years, depending on the life of material chosen, I mean, all of these, they hold project possibilities that are, that you can suddenly create a city that is full of inspiration.
They're just selling these metro spaces to big corporations for advertising, and
Yeah.
made a real
In fact,
horrible aesthetic situation in Delhi with the metro.
So whose responsibility really is? Who has the onus of this? I've been deeply disappointed actually speaking to builders and asking them why they are not building at least one building as a legacy building. And the answer that I've received is that how would we ever get any returns on our investment for doing that? And what is that purpose? So when you get this kind of a response from the people who can actually make something happen, then how do we save the nation going forwards?
That's another question I always have of public buildings. Firstly, yes, unfortunately, if you talk to a builder, you don't go beyond FSI and carpet area calculation for the till at least my brain switches off. So therefore, I've never managed to work with builders. But even when the whole concept of, you mentioned metro stations, the whole concept of public architecture. Now, even in the Soviet regime, when you had metro stations, if you go to the metro stations in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, they are
Amazing.
stunning. They are
Stunning.
beautiful
Yeah.
buildings. They're just not functional. They are visually and architecturally stunning. So even at the height of Bolshevism, they were willing to spend on the beauty and aesthetics of metro station because they perceived this as public architecture. And what I never understood is in India, why we think that public buildings should be cheap and not good to look at, only just serviceable, when the whole idea of public is, if you're building a public library or a public building, you are catering to more people. In India, we spend more money on private buildings, which are catering to few people. But when it comes to a public building, the first thing that is compromised is the quality and the aesthetics. The rest of the utility and construction might continue. That is something we need to change, because if I want to make a public building, my idea is that if I'm truly looking at democratizing the country, the public building should be the most beautiful, should be the most architecturally and aesthetically wonderful, and because it's catering to a larger audience. And unfortunately, it's just the opposite, or has been for the last so many decades.
So why are we delivering so little to so many?
I don't, I also don't think this is purely an Indian issue. I think it's like some sort of a generational curse. Like we need to wait for a few people to die for things to kind of improve a little bit. So for example, there was these statistics by the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, right? They looked at how many architects were contributing to public architecture in the UK, and it was 5%. Right, so essentially 95%, which is 20,000 homes in 2017, were built without the consultation of an architect. So these are being built by different agencies like civil engineers, public works engineers, off some sort of old template. So statistically, I think everywhere there's a little bit of a reimagination required in terms of public engagement. And also, I think, so I don't think it's purely an Indian situation. I think in most cases, architects chase the commissions, and I think there were some 17,000 practices that bidded for the Helsinki Museum, right? So there is obviously not a lack of architects, but I think in terms of what we've prioritized as a practice, which primarily, if you look at, let's say maybe 8 or 9 ways we get our gratification as practices. Right up there is billing, like, okay, paisa kaun dene wala hai sab ke liye, like, so, I mean, if one is chasing that paradigm, then obviously the gratification loop is very different. I mean, you have a very different trajectory as a practice. I mean, recently we've been trying to form collectives, which I think is a very interesting way of, approaching projects. Like, so we're part of, like, say 2 or 3 collectives now. There's the Bandra Collective, which is a group of architects, like including Sameep and Alan Abraham, Architecture Brio. There's us. There's a bunch of like whatever so-called Bandra files, and we kind of trying to work on Bandra-based projects. And in Goa, we're trying to figure out a Goa collective, which is more So I mean, we say you lend your voice to different collectives at different times, depending on what is required where. So I think there's some emerging models in practice which would maybe allow us to let's say engage on a larger spectrum maybe. And both these collectives are doing public facing work. So it's kind of interesting that you get access to that kind of work by being part of a collective, which is actually denied to you being a part of a insular practice maybe.
So why are more and more people not getting into the public realm? One is to have a private practice and design public buildings or publicly, but why are more people opting to not join public authorities and public sort of bodies who can actually do these things that we're talking about?
So I feel personally it's two things. I mean, it is tough, like for sure, like because like say recently we're working on the Cart Road Promenade and a couple of these kind of public spaces. There are multiple agencies to coordinate with. There's normally you're coordinating directly with the person who's building. So there are times when the project has already began, like there's a contractor on site with Ciporex blocks waiting to start putting, and you have to run with a chalk because there's no time to make drawings and all that. So you quickly, you're designing on the fly. It's a very different kind of situation. I mean, being part of this Bandra collective has been very, very amazing because different offices have different bandwidth at different times. So like say, for example, an outline that's sketched by Architecture Brio gets filled up by our office, and then someone else designs a small park. So it becomes fairly, fluid. But maybe there's a deeper sense of, I think, a felt distance from the city, right? Like in terms of, if you look at the metaphors that we assign to our city experience, like one of the biggest ones that comes to mind is the idea of the Juggernaut, right? Which comes from the Jagannath temple, like which is essentially this motive force. Like the city is something that's going to move irrespective of individual action. But then you have on the other side of the spectrum, you have a definition of the city, which is Banksy's. So he says a city is a party where everyone's invited. Like so, for example, if one buys into that conception of the city, that's the world of street art. That's the world of bottom-up activism. That's the world of guerrilla gardening. That's the world of kind of taking agency and being part of this kind of sort of renaissance. Like just and the renaissance could be a very personal renaissance. It need not be something that is written about in history books, but it's a very different conception of a city. It's the bottom-up city as against to the top-down city.
So taking off from what Asim said and what you're saying now, Ayaz, is it downsize or sky high? What is the mantra?
Especially in today's world, right? Considering everything's kind of gone bottom up.
I don't know. I mean, I would actually, imagine this more as a spectrum that there are certain things that require to be downsized and certain things that require to be up. I mean, I think in general, the consensus is really to migrate a larger part of our practices from being, private commissions to public commissions. And maybe there's a way in which if enough architects are trying to do work in the public domain, maybe there's a way of approaching policymakers to have this kind of inclusion in, maybe in favorable governments, to have an inclusion where one could say, contribute pro bono. Like, you have say if the fees are a problem, then say you do pro bono work spread across different offices that are kind of, like-minded or at least aligned towards doing public facing work. But I mean, Abha would have a lot more, insight on this, like in terms of what has it been like to work in a work in progress city. Like, I mean, your relationship with Bombay must be so different from, the relationship that like say a regular commuter has who's,
No, I think with me, it's almost like a personal journey. I walk down, if I'm driving down, my daughter used to get out by me saying, oh, when I was when you were small, I used to take you here. You grew up in the gardens of the Convocation Hall because I didn't have a babysitter and you used to just come along with me. So for me, it's literally like every through the last 25 years, and I tend to drive myself. So I've always had like one building in Fort area, which I'm working on, where I'm able to park my car and then walk from Commissioner Police Office to Crawford Market to restore that, come back to site. So yeah, for me, it's a very personal thing. But also having said that, I think this is a kind of when we talk about practices, like what kind of model we've always gone by. Uh, Initially I thought that, okay, as a conservation architect or as an architect, I'll work on this, the Deutsche Bank, Tata Palace, where there's a brief and there's a client and this. But then you get drawn into, and sometimes you have to make a, like a serious choice that pyar chahiye ya paisa chahiye. So it's always been a question in my practice and the kind of projects we select, that there are some projects that you think through and say, okay, this is a brief, it's good, it's going to run our firm, or it's going to be able to keep our firm going for this so many months or so many years. But then there are these amazing bleeding heart projects and you just cannot stop yourself. My associates try physically to stop me from taking them on, but I think eventually it works, because one project subsidizes the other. And very often the projects that you pour your soul into take a long time. Like Crawford Market, we were appointed in 2007, and it is now in 2020 that we are going to lay the foundation of our first basement. It's a 13-year long thing, because we were given the project and then it was handed over to a builder and he was going to build at FSI 4. So this, with public buildings and public spaces, there's so much, there regime changes, there are policy decisions, the things affect things. We've gone right up to Supreme Court. So we were working on Gold Market. We were appointed 15 years ago. We're still waiting for the project to start, because there was a court case that between the stakeholders and NDMC, which went on. So yes, there are huge pitfalls to taking our public projects, but then the kind of work satisfaction it gives you to make one change. We work pro bono for working on the Bharatpur Museum, converting a Sarkari museum into what we thought could be the best state-of-the-art experience you could give to any visitor, but in a small Mufassil town like Bharatpur, not even a level 3 city. But what it does is the kind of, if you're able to make one typological change or a project that becomes a pilot, it's then, in India we're very good at copy paste. So I just feel that if we're able to touch one type of typology of project and prove that yes, a Sarkari museum can be also exciting, or a citizen driven conservation of a mud temple can then help 10 other villages follow suit. So then we won't get into now doing the same kind of 20 projects of the same kind. But if we've done our job, we've demonstrated it with one project, then there are enough local architects to do the next 20 projects. So that's what we've tried to do.
I think
sorry,
just to kind of carry on Abha's train of thought, I think what's interesting is that we're talking a lot about the creator and the consumer, right? So we're talking about the architect, and we're talking about the person who's commissioning the work, whether it's the government or whether they're private clients. But it's also about the spectator, and it's about involving the spectator in the process. And so the onus kind of is split amongst everybody. It's not only the architect or the designer. And what becomes interesting is that how do we involve the spectator? How do we weave them into the conversation? Which I think is done a fair amount through public engagement, in terms of like a lot of your, whether they're public art installations or whether it's, talks and lectures and things like that. And Asim, some of your work in Bengal, for that matter, I think Rajshri, you wanted to bring that in as well.
Thank you, Mrinalini. I was pleasantly surprised that the Arjunpur Amra Sabai Club actually invited you to do this Durga Puja Pandal. I mean, someone like a club actually thinking about sustainability and using vernacular technologies as you do. I mean, that is very heartening to know, Asim, and that the funding was given for it, and the spectator engagement was huge. I mean, there were people from not only the locals, but people from all over the world looked at that project, both physically and on the and virtually. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, this person I was interacting with, who is the puja in charge of the club, he's a unique person, a gem of an individual. So he found me online. I mean, I asked him, how did you find me? and he said he's just searched on Google for young Indian artists, and I was seventh on the list, and he liked my work, and he found my email address, and he wrote to me. But when he contacted me, actually, it was quite a fortunate coincidence, because I had been looking at the Durga Puja from the outside for many years, because they do some amazing work with bamboo and cane and a lot of other things. But more often than not, that is a structural thing, which is then decorated with fabrics or some other kind of a decoration. So you don't really see the material that much. So and I mean, I've worked with institutions all over the world, but this project was just a dream. I had so much freedom. I never gave a proposal of what I was going to make, so then I could make anything, whatever. So I sort of tried to create a process, design the process more than what the product is going to be, and design the team members, the how people will interact with each other, which people need are good working with what sort of materials and resources, and then trying to sort of look at it like a symphony for 3 months of construction, from and like what can lead to what. So we tried many things, half of which we trashed and actually abandoned. So it was like a very experimental process. And this guy, the neighborhood actually is a very poor neighborhood and middle income. Um, and it's in North Calcutta. And North Calcutta has not traditionally been known for good, what they call theme pujas. Usually a traditional puja happens in North Calcutta. So he was talking to some friend of his some 12, 15 years back, and dreaming about how he wants to do an amazing theme puja in his neighborhood. And his friend told him that in your neighborhood, it is not possible. It cannot happen. And he took that up as a challenge, actually. And every year he's escalating his own expectations and his own sort of experiments in that place. Um, but yeah, I had total freedom. I had total freedom to set up my own team, whatever materials I wanted. There was a budget which was quite good, and there is that site which was very problematic. But yeah.
What were your learnings from this experience, Asim?
Well, actually, now having worked on many large scale projects with large teams, um, I've become really keen to try and orchestrate a situation where you get relevant material and relevant skill sets together, and create a situation where people in the team start learning from each other, start doing each other's tasks, and even interfering. So I want to sort of try and decentralize the creative decision making process. So even though I am sort of controlling the processes, but a lot of things happened which I could not have imagined as an individual. And in this particular project, especially, we got on such good terms with the different team members that even craftsmen who in the normal hierarchy would not really discuss any aesthetic decision with the artist. I was the artist. Artist is a big profile in the whole puja pandal scene, but we were comfortable enough to criticize each other and interfere in each other's work. So it was a very productive project for me. Yeah.
Do you have any pictures to show very quickly, if you have any? Or in the meantime, I mean, this is the book, Asim's book. I would like all of you to get it and look at the pictures. It's very, very impressive. Also, of course, everything is on the net. Take a look at it, all the young audience who's watching this program, because it's really about using vernacular technologies and a collective way of working on sustainable architecture forms, which I think is very, very interesting.
No, one thing that really stood out when I was, leafing through the book, it's I mean, obviously it's visually stunning, right? But I think what I could really see is, Asim, the teacher there, because like, you know, it's really lovely that if you look at the conception of education, right, most architecture education follows the 60s modernist kind of education, like essentially form follows function and the whole causality and the, you know, if then problem solution kind of framing. But a lot of this actually collapsed in the late 80s with, you know, with postmodernism, where, you know, every point has a counterpoint, and there is no single way to do things. And in that kind of conception of education, it actually becomes more important to set up an intelligent network rather than a SOP or like a way of going about things. Like, so I mean, this is the way, let's say, the difference between a tree, the way a tree functions and the way a bamboo grove functions, right? The bamboo grove is a lot more resilient because it cannot be cut by a single axe. It has an underground rhizomatic framework that whenever the situation is favorable, it kind of, you know, sends up another shoot. So it's a very resilient structure. And I think, you know, you can decode that in his work beautifully, because, you know, the team that has put this together is now suddenly empowered to create beautiful objects, you know, across so many different contexts. I mean, so as soon as the right patronage or the right kind of climate appears, like the team can reassemble to kind of, you know, do something different, better. So, I mean, and this is really what pushes culture forward. I mean, this is really, I guess, what all of us should be doing with our own practices, like, you know, to kind of firstly understand what we're doing and decode it in a way that it becomes accessible to, you know, I think one of the biggest problems also with, I guess, with my kind of practices, right? Because I'm somewhere in the middle of what Asim and Abha do. We tend to use jargon a lot. Like we tend to kind of, you know, use the language of curators because it becomes, it allows us to get a higher sell price. Like, you know, it's the kind of linguistic tools that allow me to charge a bit more because, you know, we can refer to art history, or we could refer to, you know, oh, this house, this texture is, you know, it has to be because it is the way it is. And, you know, I mean, it's all that kind of esoteric nonsense that that we use in juries in architecture school, and then we carry on in practice. But I think in this kind of larger conception of skill, like, you know, and skill on its own terms, it's not skill that is, you know, being taught to someone. It's really skill that is allowed to emerge from an intelligent network. I think it's a fundamentally different way of education. You know, I mean, if that educational kind of framework is in place, people get agency. You know, each individual gets agency in that kind of situation.
Yeah, sure.
Salute.
No, I think actually I'm really disappointed with the way we're teaching our younger generations, you know, sort of systems that we are following. Because then when we start to have discussions like this, actually a lot of it has got to do with how do you unteach people a lot of stuff that they have been fed with, which is so sort of counterproductive, you know, as a sort of a societal system of any sort. I don't know.
It's fascinating, you know, all our conversations, the last two conversations, and this is the third one now, we all end up on this topic at some point or the other, where we're talking about this whole idea of what are we learning in school and then what are we actually doing in practice. And that is going to be our culminating conversation. So next week on Saturday, and you know, it would be great if all of you could tune in,
Yeah,
including
could
our
tune in.
speakers, the three of you, and, you know, contribute to that, because it seems to be a recurring sort of concern for all of us, for people who are practicing or not. It's definitely a recurring concern. But I'm going to put in a couple of questions that we're getting in at this point. And we've been talking a lot about the collective. We're talking a lot about interacting with the public and people. And we've got Gayatri on Zoom who's asking, she says, it's a very interesting discussion. Thank you. What about a public-private partnership for these big projects that we're talking about? So are any of you interested in or are doing something of this sort, or what are your opinions on these?
If I may, I think public-private partnerships are the way to go, because if you're looking at public architecture, unless it's something like, you know, like the Central Vista or something where it's a government vision, they're mostly either not funded enough adequately, or the vision is not wide enough to allow both art, architecture, and aesthetics to get you know, a word in edgewise. So having said that, I think public-private partnership is really the way to go. There have been many conservation projects, not many, but a few, which have been, you know, funded through corporate social responsibility. or actually even communities. And the whole concept of conservation is that it's trying to nostalgia. It's basically trying to save your identity. And if it is important to those that constituency of people for whom that identity holds meaning, they need to make sure that they contribute to make it to make it survive. And it's just that unfortunately in our country, we even in CSR, most corporates see CSR initiatives as, the important things for them. High priorities always education and healthcare and other things, and conservation seems almost something that is very low on the pecking order, whether it's government funding or CSR funding, because they say, oh, but there's so many more important things. The point is, if you're losing the very identity of your built heritage, and if it's a kind of a double-edged sword where it doesn't get that kind of leverage. But yes, corporate responsibility, public-private partnership are the future for this.
In
Um,
fact, we were sorry, go ahead, Az.
No, I just had a little bit to add on the nostalgia bit, right? Because what's really interesting is that nostalgia as a political tool becomes a very slippery slope, right? Because this is a situation that eventually pushes us towards ideas of a purist past, right? In the sense that things were better in the past, and now, I mean, a lot of politics plays on the uncertainty around the present and the future to reinforce ideas of a glorious past, which I think historically we've seen is a very, very slippery slope, right? I mean, a society that kind of goes down that road, tends to go down the road of the concentration camps, right? So I think what would be really interesting to kind of explore is this idea of nostalgia for the future, right? Because nostalgia can actually be experienced for the future if as practitioners, we are able to put out visions of the future that are extremely compelling, right? Like you could put out an image of the city that says, okay, this is what your city could be like. Uh, and then there's a certain internal kind of a feeling that, why am I not living in that city already? And that's been actually one of the interesting formulations of some of the work that we've been doing around speculative fiction, where you take Bombay as a canvas and try to imagine what it would take to thrive in a flooding city, right? Like, say for example, in 2035, with 2 degrees of temperature change, Bombay is going to be under 6 feet of water, right? These are sort of published statistics. Now, what is your art experience in a submerged city? Like, I mean, will we go the Venice way, where you have I mean, weirdly enough, India could have been planned in 2 ways in the colonial rule. It could have been planned through railways, or it could have been planned through canals. So it's very tough for us to imagine an India that's linked by canals as against the railway system, right? So this was a choice that the British made, that we will use railways and not canals. But these alternate futures also exist. That if Bombay is an underwater city and it goes back to being the Seven Islands, what is it like to live in that city? Who owns the politics? Who owns the most land? I mean, so these kind of speculative fictions actually allow us to engage with more provocative futures that we can then choose. Like, it kind of gives you a more motivational factor, saying that, let's feel the same nostalgia, let's feel the same urge to action, but feel it for a coming reality.
Well, I have to say, you know what, Ayaz, it's some of these posts that you put on social media, right, on Instagram, they're kind of scary, but so many times, I'm flipping through my feed and I'll come across a post like this and I'm like, oh my God, did this really happen? And then you kind of go through it and you say, oh, this is 2035, right, as anticipated in the future.
Abhi hai
But
15 saal.
no, but the funny part over here is that it is so close to reality that I feel like today we can't necessarily draw that line between what is happening today or what is the potential for something to happen today versus this whole, when we were in school and we used to be asking, how do you imagine the new century to be like? And we'd be drawing these flying cars and these massive matrix like scenarios, right? But we are so close to that that gap that we're talking about between the present and the future is very, very tiny. right? And when I say future, I'm talking about this dystopian future that we've imagined for us, for ourselves.
Yeah.
But it is much smaller than we necessarily admit for it to be. And so also coming back to what we were talking about, this whole idea of, the railways and the metro. I know, Asim, you have to leave soon, so I'm going to address this question to you. Is that you mentioned how the Delhi metro system is kind of, is going to the dogs if it already hasn't, given the fact that each station has been, pawned off to a big conglomerate or a corporate. But my question over there is that even if it has been, there is still potential for us to do something there, right? It can still be, like Abha said, we're talking about the CSR. I think at some level we become very accepting of the idea that, oh, India's got so many problems, right? Whether it's population or poverty or hunger or this or that, and therefore everything keeps getting down, it keeps getting deprioritized. But the fact that you're giving this out to corporations, do you think that we can take some responsibility and say that, okay, corporations are doing this, but how about we come into private partnership with you and do something about it? Or do you think it could also, instead of doing a public-private, it could also be a private-private partnership? Do you think people like us as individuals or as communities or collectives that we keep talking about can come in partnership with them and do something and change that landscape?
I'm sure there's a lot of possibility and there's a lot of interesting partnerships happening. I'm not sure that the only partnership that will be successful is a public-private partnership. There are many other kinds of partnership we need to develop.
Sure.
But with regard to the Delhi Metro, I mean, I think they had no intention of any aesthetic value when they were making the metro. They were only trying to make a function system that will be okay visually. Only perhaps in the Connaught Place metro station, the Rajiv Gandhi metro station, is there some attempt for aesthetic. And the way the metros have been giving to corporations have got nothing to do with aesthetics again. It's got to do only with advertising revenue. And it is actually done in such a thoughtless manner that now the name of the metro station is actually mixed with the name of the sponsor.
Sponsoring brand.
So, and there is no uniformity from one metro station to another. So a lot of times, if you were new to Delhi and you didn't know it was a metro station, you wouldn't be able to make out because you would think it's that sponsors building or something, So again, in terms of public architecture or whatever, I don't know, it's a very complex thing because also there's the whole CPWD regulations for construction and stuff. But quite often the intention is a bit naive or unthought of, perhaps.
The issue is, I've been doing India Design Forum since 2012 and work with the government, with policymakers and so on. And the common thread of thought at that level is that design, architecture, these are really not a priority for us. These are excesses after health and education is met. It's not a priority. Very often
luxuries. They're
luxury. They're elitist, and this notion somehow has to change because when you take the cross section of a civilization, ancient civilization, mid-century civilizations, what we really are talking about is their culture. It's their buildings, it's their music, it's their art that defines a civilization and the progressive nature of a nation. And somehow we haven't been able to give priority for these things. And I think we need to speak a lot more about why this needs to be a priority.
Yeah, actually, in the current political situation, there is a lot of intent to make iconic architecture. But like if you look at, for example, the Pragati Maidan redevelopment that's happening in New Delhi. But it is, or even the Central Vista redevelopment that's happening, But it appears that the people who designed that project or who conceptualized that project looked at it like a blank slate, and so they wiped out everything that was there and then made this new thing. And we can go into the values of the new design. That's a different aspect, but I think in the same place, whether it's Pragati Maidan or Central Vista, it's possible to make such good new architecture while retaining a lot of the old stuff as well. So then there is that continuity that is there between what was there, what we're living in, and what we're trying to maybe achieve, rather than just sort of wipe out and make this new.
I think
another building.
I mean, don't you feel it's the ripple effect of the idea of the nation anyway? Like, I mean,
Of course it is.
the intent is to wipe a clean slate and to start afresh. I mean, that's if it was about continuity and about being baton holders, I mean, I think the whole thing would have been more light-handed. I mean, it wouldn't have been a heavy-handed approach.
Which validates my claim that architecture is a very political profession.
Yeah, it is.
Completely.
It's a very
Completely.
political act,
Yeah.
and
But
it
yeah,
reflects the times.
but Abha, it's also the identity of a nation. And you said that. And it shows a certain,
It
you
shows
know,
the direction in which we are heading
Yeah.
as a nation right now, or the current politics of our nation, or where we are at a given time. It's just that what's what we have at different windows of time, and the kind of direction that public architecture takes. They're still in the Indian context, they're still on that timeline. They're just these dots that, okay, this time there was a very strong approach. It might be good, bad, or ugly, the approach, but there was a strong view towards public architecture. But in our country also, there's just been this one long never land of public architecture, when there's really been no political thought, good,
Sure.
bad, or ugly. And we've just continued in that same CPWD thappa of a diluted concrete dabba that continued to be
Yeah.
our public architecture for more than 5 decades.
There's some sort of gender issue also here, I feel, like I think we need to shift policy making to women, like permanently for the next, like, I don't know, 20, 30 years. Like, it's mostly, the people making these aesthetic decisions are mostly like, 50 plus men in a closed room, like a, badly air conditioned place. It's not being designed like sitting in like a summer palace in Kabul or something. It's like not a, मतलब वो सब पूरा planning A4 sheet पे ही कर रहे हैं ना, like the table only has no
Yeah.
space to draw on something larger. I mean, Abha, I would vote for you, man.
Speaking about, I'm deeply impressed with the Temple of Steps designed by Sameep Padora in Nandyal. I mean, to do this, I think is a tremendous step in the right direction to what we're all saying about bridging certain gaps, because I mean, the cultural expectations of a temple with the ecological framework and the dynamics of this water treatment around the site and all of that, I think it's amazing. I mean, Nandyal is in the middle of nowhere, and it's a village, and how the locals have accepted this contemporary modern architectural format, which is very different from the temples they've been identified with. So I think this is an amazing kind of development.
Yep, for sure. It's very
I
cool.
would, sorry, Rashi, to cut this short a little bit, but Asim has to leave. So I just wanted to,
Yeah,
we
I
can
just wanted to
continue the
say-
conversation if Ayaz and Abha, if you're available and would like to take this further, we'd be happy
I
to.
think we've already given our audience 1.5 hours without a loo break, so I think we could all wrap.
कान से खून टपक रहा होगा.
Nalini, any questions? Very quickly, then we can...
We've got a bunch of questions and comments, but I have to say the most intriguing of the lot has been from someone called the Bus Ride, who has sent a comment saying Abha for president. So, which I think I will definitely, I'll be the first one to second that thought.
That was me, actually.
Yes, yes.
Is that from your office?
That is Ayaz himself.
From my heart.
But I would yes, we do have some questions. I know Ayush Kasliwal has been asking something on Instagram, but we have to wrap up right now. Sorry, Ayush, I'll kind of forward this comment to them later. But I do want to thank you all for being here tonight with us, for sparing your Saturday evening and having an open and honest conversation. There's so much more that we can talk about, and there's so much more to explore in this. We're obviously, there's certain recurring themes that come in every conversation. And I have to say, one, besides the education aspect of things, the Central Vista is definitely something that is on people's minds. And it would be, maybe interesting just to have a session just on that and get different people to talk about it. But thank you all, Ayaz, Abha, and Asim, for being here. And maybe we'll kind of do a part 2 and get you all back so that we can continue this conversation another day.
And thanks to all our partners, Dezeen Events Guide, Design Pataki, Establish, and everyone.
And we've got a small but enthusiastic team that's working behind the scenes. We've got Namita and Nisha and Meher who are kind of helping us put all of this together. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you.
On Zoom, on Instagram and Facebook.
Thank you, Rajshri and Mrinalini. And we will do this over glasses of actual wine at Coimbatore.
In Coimbatore, yes.
Okay, looking forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend ahead.
Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Bye, guys.